Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist before he was even born? It is literally one of the biggest mysteries in historical theology. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating piece of research by Mark Bates that unpacks a really rigorous canonical defense of Christ's eternal ontological identity. By looking at the historical context, biblical grammar, and these massive macro-narrative themes, we're going to explore the evidence for Christ's preexistence exactly as it's presented in the source material.
Okay, let's dive right into this roadmap. We'll be covering the debate over Christ's origins, ideal versus real preexistence, decoding Luke's virgin birth, the I came sayings, early high Christology evidence, and finally, the unified promise plan. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The debate over Christ's origins.
To really wrap our heads around the debate over Jesus' identity, the source argues we've got to step back into the mindset of Second Temple Judaism. Back then, there was this massive, totally uncrossable boundary between the Creator and, well, everything that was created. Think of it like a painter and a painting. They are fundamentally different things. To assess Jesus, the author points out we first have to define God's actual attributes. And in this historical context, the main thing separating Yahweh from creation isn't just his power, it's his eternality. Creation has a beginning. God doesn't. This is what the Greek term theotēs represents. It's the uncreated eternal essence of God. So the logic goes, any being that existed before creation and through whom creation occurred absolutely has to share this unique, uncreated nature.
And that brings us to a huge divide in modern scholarship. A lot of post-Enlightenment scholars lean towards a functional Christology. Basically, they argue that early believers initially only saw Jesus functionally, meaning he was an exalted human or a prophet who was just delegated the authority to do God's work. But drawing on research from scholars like Robert Bowman Jr. and J. Komosinski, our source contends that if you do a really close, text-driven reading of the New Testament, you actually find an ontological Christology. In plain English, the texts inseparably link Jesus' functional roles, like creating the universe, directly to his eternal being. He didn't just act like God. The argument is that his very nature was uncreated.
Section 2. Ideal versus real preexistence.
So the crucial point here is the difference between being a blueprint in the mind of an architect and being the architect yourself. A lot of modern scholars, like James D.G. Dunn, along with Unitarian apologists, argue for what's called ideal preexistence. They claim that when early texts talk about Christ existing before creation, they literally just mean he existed as a foreordained plan or intention in the mind of God, just a blueprint. Under this view, Jesus only began to actually personally exist at his physical conception.
But the author pushes back hard on this, using texts like 1 Corinthians 8:6. You see, in ancient Hebraic thought, a mere foreknown plan is never treated as the active agent that creates the physical universe. Think about it for a second. To a fiercely monotheistic Jewish audience, calling a mere human plan the agent through whom are all things wouldn't just be confusing, it would be borderline scandalous. The active verbs and the personal pronouns used in these texts strongly imply a real, personal preexistence, not just a theoretical concept.
Which brings up a really provocative question, and honestly, a major focal point for critics. Did Jesus' divine sonship actually begin at his conception in Mary's womb?
Section 3. Decoding Luke's virgin birth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can use grammar to decode the virgin birth narrative. Luke 1:35 is constantly cited by critics as definitive proof that Jesus had zero personal existence prior to conception. They look at the Greek word hagion, which means holy, and read it as an attributive adjective, so they translate it as the holy offspring, implying his existence starts right at that exact moment. But Bowman and Komosinski point out that the syntax actually shows hagion is a predicate adjective. It should read, the child to be born will be called holy. Now, why does a tiny grammar shift matter so much? Because it means Luke isn't marking the temporal starting point of the Son. Instead, the author argues the virgin birth is an incarnation mechanism designed for moral purity. It's a pure entry point, allowing a son who already existed to enter humanity without inheriting fallen corruption.
Section 4. The I came sayings.
Moving past the birth narratives, we hit the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, a super common critical claim is that these three books only have a low Christology, basically portraying Jesus as just a human prophet, and that it's only the Gospel of John that portrays him as a pre-existent divine figure. But the source highlights some brilliant research by Simon Gathercole. He specifically examined the Elthon, or I came, statements in the Synoptics, like this famous one from Mark 10. The author argues that these statements actually show a conscious, deeply rooted awareness of a heavenly origin.
Gathercole points out a really stark, intentional contrast in the language used here. When ordinary human prophets, like John the Baptist, are described in the texts, they're sent. They arrive on the public stage for a specific task, kind of like a messenger delivering a letter. But Jesus talks about coming from an outside domain to alter divine law and perform cosmic duties. The spatial and temporal descent is perfectly reinforced in the parable of the wicked tenants. The prophets are just human servants who are already inside the vineyard, right? But the Son comes from the owner's private sphere completely outside the vineyard. It's a totally different point of origin.
Section 5. Early High Christology Evidence.
This brings us to a fascinating historical timeline that goes head-to-head with a really prominent modern theory. Scholars like Bart Ehrman propose this evolutionary backward trajectory model. Essentially, this theory suggests that early believers first thought Jesus became divine at his resurrection. Then, maybe decades later, the belief evolved and they pushed it back to his baptism, then later to his virgin birth, and finally, right at the end of the first century, they pushed it all the way back to pre-creational eternity.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's counter-argument, because look at the actual historical timeline of the texts, the absolute earliest surviving Christian documents. We're talking Paul's epistles from the late 40s to early 60s AD, and that famous Christ hymn in Philippians 2 dating all the way back to the 30s or 40s AD. They already contain explicit, fully formed high Christology. Just think about how surprising that is for a second. They affirm his personal preexistence and divine agency in creation long before the Gospels were even written. According to the source, high Christology didn't slowly evolve over decades. The evidence shows it was there from the absolute beginning.
Section 6. The Unified Promise Plan.
So how does this all fit into the big picture, the macro narrative of the Bible? Systematic theology sometimes treats preexistence as just a standalone, abstract, metaphysical fact, but the source situates it dynamically within God's overarching design. This framework is known as the Promise Plan, a theological concept developed by Walter C. Kaiser Jr. It describes this incredibly unified, progressively unfolding purpose across all of redemptive history. The author argues that within this framework, the pre-existent Son wasn't just sitting passively in heaven waiting for his birth in Bethlehem. No, he was the active, dynamic mediator of God's covenantal actions throughout the entire Old Testament.
If you look at the chronological progression of these promises, starting way back with the seed of the woman in Genesis 3, rolling through the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants, all the way to the New Covenant, the author contends that it's the pre-existent Son who authors these promises. And because it is the uncreated God personally entering human history, the incarnation isn't just some random afterthought. It acts as the ultimate direct culmination of this continuous, ages-old plan.
And there's a really important so what here. This view of preexistence secures what scholars call a non-supersessionist view of the end times. To put that simply, it means God doesn't cancel his old promises just to make new ones. Like Paul writes in Romans 11:29, "The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." The author argues that because the pre-existent Son is the original mediator of these ancient covenants, his incarnation doesn't cancel out or transfer the concrete historical promises made to ethnic Israel. Instead, it perfectly secures eternal redemption for all the nations while keeping those historical promises completely intact within the one people of God.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've explored Greek grammar, historical timelines, and massive macro-narrative frameworks, all based on the source text's defense of Christ's preexistence. If the absolute earliest historical texts place Jesus squarely within the unique, uncreated identity of the Creator, how does that reshape your understanding of the entire biblical narrative? It is a profoundly deep concept that really challenges evolutionary views of history and invites all of us to look a little closer at the ancient texts. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I definitely encourage you to check out the source material to explore these ideas even further.